Hello and welcome to Small Biz Central, the show where we exchange information and ideas about small business. I'm Tim Burnero. On this episode of Small Biz Central, we are going to talk about the legalities for small business owners. We're joined, of course, by our panel of experts. Don Wright with the University of Western Sydney. G'day, Don.
G'day, Tim.
Allira Hudson-Gofers, registered patent attorney from Shelton IP and Australian handball representative. Welcome, Allira.
Thanks, Tim.
And Professor Michael Adams, who is Head of School Law at the University of Western Sydney. G'day, Michael.
Hi, Tim.
Okay, let's meet our first business.
Hi, my name's Jay and I'm the founding director of Jumping Jack Inflatables. I started the business in 1991 in my garage in St Clair. We now trade out of a factory complex in Mount Druitt and we hire inflatables, repair, design and manufacture inflatables, and we export our inflatables all around the world and of course all around Australia. Before I started the Jumping Castle inflatable business, I was working in party hire with marquees and tables and chairs, and it was that background that I started to become interested in children's backyard parties, because we started to receive some inquiries through the business, people looking for a jumping castle for a children's backyard party. And back in the early 90s, small inflatables didn't exist. It was really the domain of large fetes, and that's what basically got me thinking, and I found some inflatables in England and they were already doing backyard parties, so that's how we got started. We now make inflatables for the aquatic industry, such as large Olympic pools. We make inflatables for gymnastics. We also make marquees, movie screens. We've also moved into sealed air technology now. So the old technology used to be constant air technology, where the fan would be put on and would stay on. Now we actually use sealed technology, so the inflatable is inflated and the fan is turned off and it stays sealed like a balloon. So there's no noise in the background. The air pressure is much better, so it's a much sounder structure, and it's actually opened a lot more markets for us now. I had no business plan, and I had no thought whatsoever that we would turn it into a large business, but the business evolved, I guess, organically, and I actually have no formal training per se. I'm self-taught both in business and design and manufacturing. I taught myself to sew, to cut out inflatables and to make them, and then I've now passed those skills on to my staff. We have permanent staff here is 7 staff, but we also have casual staff that work on the weekends delivering our jumping castles to the parties. So we can have up to a dozen staff working at our peak time. Yeah, we mainly export to the Asian Pacific area. At the moment we've got inflatables going to Malaysia and Cambodia, but mainly the Asian Pacific area is where our strength is, because even though the Chinese have a big influence on the market because they have a cheap product, people look to our market for quality. Jumping Jack Inflatables is a standout from the rest of people that I call watch me, I can do it too, because we treat people the way we like to be treated. We're still a small family business. We never shortcut. And if it costs a bit more to do a job, then we'll spend a bit more and make a little bit less. Trying to protect our intellectual property in a global market, it just seems impossible. We can certainly protect ourselves in Australia and New Zealand, but protecting our intellectual property in overseas markets, and then having our goods made, say in China, and then brought back into Australia, it really comes down to trademark registration and design registration is all well and good, but you have to have a lot of money to actually fight people when they infringe on your intellectual property, and that's where you have to make the call whether it's worth throwing thousands of dollars at a court case to try and protect your property.
Jumping Jack Inflatables there, and what an absolutely fantastic business. It is a mum and dad operation, Don, and just so wonderful that he's self-taught and has just grown the whole thing
Fantastic
himself.
to see one of those little hidden success stories that exist around the place, and lots of issues there that he raises, and one of those catch-22 situations of having to spend the money up front to protect yourself, and then also having to spend that money to try and protect against an infringement if it happens. Lots of challenges there for him, I can see.
Well, it's lucky we've got an IP lawyer here.
Absolutely.
Allira, welcome to the show, of course. And what are the steps? I've invented something. What do I do?
I guess the first thing that you need to do, Tim, would be identify what type of protection you need. As a first step, before you even have a product, you have a business, you have a brand. So we look at trademark registrations to protect your brand, your logo. After that, you might have a product which looks completely different to anything you've ever seen before. So that's something where design registrations would be useful. I know Jay mentioned both of them just then. But there's also something called patent protection. So if you have something which, I guess, essentially functions differently, patent protection would be what you'd be looking at.
Oh, I see. So a trademark is something like a logo or a symbol, your business...
Something like Coca-Cola.
Something like Coca-Cola, okay. Whereas a patent is something you've invented, or a process or a thing, a widget, that you want to make sure someone else isn't manufacturing when you're the one who's actually invented it. What do you actually do when I walk in to your office with my new widget? Do you do sort of like a Google search on steroids to sort of make sure no one else has got something similar?
So yeah, that is a good step. Obviously protection is important, but also the right to go out and market your product is important as well. You don't want to infringe someone else's rights, for example, with what you've done.
And so you'll have a business register that and make sure that they've got it all sealed up. But what about Australia versus the rest of the world? I mean, Jay's, sending stuff to Asia. Do you have to do it for every separate country?
You do. There's no such thing as a global patent, global design. You need to register in each of the markets that you're interested in. So, the markets that you're selling in is where you'd want to protect. I guess funds are obviously limited for a lot of businesses. You then prioritise your market. So you identify where you're going to go, where you're going to make your profit, and you protect there. And if you have to let a smaller country, go and just, see what happens, then that might be the call you have to make.
Michael, is it really worth it if someone's infringing my intellectual property, but I'm at capacity, and I think sort of Jumping Jack Inflatables is pretty much at capacity, is it really worth taking them on?
That's a good commercial question. Part of it, of course, is your reputation and your quality. You don't want to have an imitator undermine your product. But you'd have to do some sort of cost-benefit analysis to how much money you want to spend, how rigorously you want to defend. One idea in some markets is you might want to, particularly, say, China or India, think about something like a joint venture whereby you have a local partner. They may want to help you enforce your rights locally, as well as keeping your quality all under control.
Because, Allira, you do that as well, don't you? People come to you and you help them commercialise through other people, so I suppose through getting royalties, so someone else is making it with their invention.
That's right. We have a commercialisation group who will look at licensing agreements to set up such agreements between parties in countries overseas or companies. Sorry.
Well, listen, this is a two-way conversation. Our friends at Jumping Jack Inflatables have got a question for you guys.
My question to the panel is, how does a small business with big ideas reasonably protect their IP in a global market? So,
Allira, what are you going to do if someone in Malaysia or in India is copying Jay's designs? Is it just a matter of sending them a sort of sternly worded letter?
So, the first step is making sure that your IP rights are set up in the countries, in your markets, in the countries that you want. So, if your rights are strongly set out, you're protecting your product and what you want to protect, then often that is a good first step. You have an IP professional write a letter, even just notifying the party that these rights exist and that they may potentially be infringing them, and often that's enough just to nip it in the bud.
Because it's going to cost me money in each country that I register my intellectual property in, so I don't want to be just registering it everywhere if I'm not actually in those markets.
That is true. There are ways of protecting. For example, for Jay, it appears that a lot of his protection on the product will be the design. And for registering a design, that can be done quite cheaply. You don't need to go through examination, so it's a relatively cheap cost. And you can also submit photos with your application to bring the cost down a little bit as well. But as I said before, it's a matter of prioritising the markets that are really important to you and protecting in those markets first.
Michael, what if, this is certainly the case in Jumping Jack Inflatables' case, they're doing stuff with the Wiggles. Does that add a whole layer of kind of trademark complexity to this question?
It does, because obviously the Wiggles want to protect their intellectual property, and as such they want to make sure it's been licensed appropriately. So there will be an agreement between the Wiggles and Jumping Jack, and then Jumping Jack obviously has to make sure they don't do anything to infringe those particular rights. But usually that's all clearly done, and I was going to say for Jumping Jack, documentation would be really important, laying things out very clearly in a business case. As you develop new products, making sure you record how you've designed them. Use photographs are a great way of indicating. And then if you notice infringement, the first step is actually writing a letter saying, are you aware this is our product, this is our design, we've had it from such and such a date. It gives a real level playing field to your positioning in the market.
I think if you can get in early, and even at his early stages, he said he didn't plan for the business and he didn't know where it was going to go. But as soon as you start that process of developing the business, as soon as you see some IP materialising, it's great to plan for it, start to investigate the costs of markets that you may want to go and protect in, so you know what you're up for. So try and think about it early.
Allira, is it true that if I've invented something but I've been a bit of a loudmouth, talking about it down the pub, mentioning it when I speak to trade magazines, that I've only got 12 months from when I publicly disclose it to get it patented?
It depends on the country as well. Some countries will have a prior disclosure in their legislation, whereas others won't. So you may be at risk that if you've disclosed it somewhere, you might cut out a market that you're interested in somewhere else. So I mean, the safest thing to do is before you tell anyone, speak to a professional and get your IP sorted out in order.
And of course, as Michael's going to tell us over and over again, it's his mantra: get some documentation, get it down on paper, because then you've got something to rely on. And even emails can serve that purpose, can't they?
Yes, certainly. That communication part is really important. It's interesting with intellectual property that some are registered, and that's registered with the government, the Commonwealth Government, so trademarks. And you'll see that little R in a circle, that means it's a registered trademark. If you actually see the letters just TM, that's more like a little asterisk to say this name is linked to this company or this particular business. That's not actually a registered trademark. Obviously, if you then copy it in some ways, you could be infringing either copyright or some other intellectual property. There's a lovely old thing called passing off, which is making your goods seem like they belong to somebody else. In modern day terms, people may know it as misleading deceptive conduct. There's a nice overlap in that area. But if you have a registered trademark, then that's something that is very, especially within Australia and New Zealand, very strongly and relatively easy to enforce, isn't it?
Don, that could be a real problem, couldn't it? Because if I'm, say, Sony, and someone else is making a product which is clearly inferior, but putting Sony on it, or even if they're not putting Sony and it's very similar to something I'm making...
That's right. That could diminish the potential value of that product in the market, across different providers. So certainly you don't want someone putting an inferior product out there that could reflect on your product in some way. That's right.
All right, well, look, let's just put the brakes on for a second because we've got to go to a quick break. Welcome back. On our first episode of Small Biz Central, we caught up with Richard from My Sydney Detour. Now, we are going to show you a recap of what his business is and pose another question that Richard has for our expert panel.
G'day, I'm Richard Graham, and this is my small business, My Sydney Detour. It's about becoming a Sydney local in a day by experiencing the three main elements that define Sydney: the city, beach and the bush, all in an authentic experience, the 1964 E.H. Holden, and your local tour guide. That's me. So one of the main challenges that I had with setting up the business was the website. And initially when I contracted a web designer, he quoted me a set fee, but I wasn't to know that he registered my domain name, Route 256, under his ABN. Now, when all these additional costs came through and I wasn't happy and I wanted to take my business elsewhere, I realised that I actually did not own the domain name, which meant that I had to completely rebrand my business and start again. I've already been burnt by a dodgy web designer that's stolen my domain name. My question to the panel is, how do I best protect myself to make sure that I keep my domain name and my brand?
Oh, poor Richard. Fancy getting burnt like that right at the start. Allira, have you got a little bit of advice to poor old Richard?
Well, in Australia, there's a group called the Australian Domain Administration, and they look at domain names with .com.au, .org.au, and there's also an international body which look at .com, .org, .net, etc. Basically, they have a dispute resolution process, which is basically an administrative process where you can bring them up, put in a form. If someone's not entitled to a domain name registration that you should be entitled to, there's complaints procedures to go through where you can rectify that kind of situation.
So Michael, I suppose it's about, again, using your mantra, having some documentation to prove that you're connected to the domain name, or more connected than some dodgy designer is anyway, and being able to go to them and show that.
That's right, and then that could include, in fact, an exchange of emails to say when they, that this is my business, and I gave the instructions to the web designer. The web designer is not the owner of that domain. They're acting as my agent to do the registration, and again, the agency is really interested in obviously the genuine owners, and if there is that documentation, they'll be happily help resolve the dispute.
Don, tax is another big issue for small business. Where do you start? I mean, tax is such a big area, especially when you're starting a small business. You've got so many things to worry about.
That's right. Well, look, there's lots of help out there to understand tax. I mean, the ATO website is a fantastic resource. They'll give you lots of information. It's in plain English. It's easy to understand. So that's your first port of call. But certainly, if you get to an issue that you just don't understand, you've got to talk to a professional, whether it's a lawyer or it's an accountant. It's really important to don't get into a situation where you may have an exposure that could cause a problem down the track. Speak to a professional and get some advice.
Michael, there's actually some free software that's available through the ATO that is in some ways better for a small business than some of the big expensive bits of software. Tell us about that.
There is. When the government introduced GST back in 2000, they realised that businesses would need to be able to report information back more frequently. And of course that's where the BAS statement came, the business activity statement, which is a reconciliation of any income you've had in that quarter and also any goods and services tax, the 10%. So the ATO actually developed some very straightforward software which is free to enable you to keep account of those transactions, and the earlier you set up your business to follow that system, the easier it's going to be. If, like Don said, you get into a bit of trouble, you fall behind, it's really important to talk to the tax office. They actually do understand in different economic circumstances things fall behind. They don't want to just impose penalties. They actually will work with you to look at deferred payments, etc. So again, a good idea to bring in a professional at a certain point. But first of all, have a good chat to the tax office.
We don't want to end up like Paul Hogan, getting in the headlines because of tax.
No.
Sometimes the discipline of the quarterly statement, we all think it, we grumble about it, but isn't it really important in terms of you don't want to end up at the end of June with a fistful of receipts? You actually want to be in a situation where every quarter you've been putting away money and, more importantly, getting down on paper the transactions that your business has been party to.
Absolutely, it's a great idea that consistency of not leaving it to a whole year later or even longer, but actually doing it on a quarterly basis. It's also a good idea for you, depending on your bank account, to have a separate one for your tax and actually put it aside, work out what the proportions are, and again, this software will suggest that, and actually transferring it out of your normal cheque bank account and transferring it to an internet bank account, so it's nice and secure. When your BAS statement needs to be sent in, you've got the money there, and when the income tax, the final reconciliation annually, that's a very easy payment, and with some of the internet banks you'll even pick up some good interest on the way.
Because you've got to remember that you're holding it for the government and you've got to pay it eventually, so you may as well do it every quarter rather than spending it all and getting to June and having to pay a big bill. But of course it's more important than that, because if you're employing people you actually have to be holding superannuation and things like that, and of course when you're dealing with other people's lives and their retirement savings, it's even more important.
Oh, absolutely, and there's no doubt that the law has come in force to look at supporting employees, but particularly their payments and in fact their insurances is another good area, as well as their employment contracts and all the things around the new laws around Fair Australia.
Yeah. Well, Don, what about OH&S? Sorry to cut you off there. Yeah. It's a big area, and you've got to make sure that, I suppose, you've got workers' comp and all those sorts of things as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got to cover your responsibilities in terms of workers' compensation. There's other mandatory insurances as well, like public liability. But certainly OH&S, it's a big responsibility, and there's a lot to understand. I mean, it's a very important issue, and as you say, you're dealing with people's lives and people's safety, so you need to get online and look at the websites that will give you the information you need, because you really have to understand your obligations as an employer.
I mean, you've run small businesses, from home, run companies, and you've actually got workers' compensation for yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I run a PL company, so I have it for myself and for an employee. But yeah, look, again, it's an important issue to understand. So if you're not sure, you need to seek some professional advice.
In fact, one of the basic questions is, what business structure do you really want legally? Are you a sole trader, a partnership, a company, proprietary or public?
Yeah.
They're actually very important business decisions you should think about up front, because each of them have a slightly different compliance cost structure. So how much you have to file with the government, for example, and those sort of issues.
The level of protection you want for your assets, the level of exposure you want to have through your business. So again, it's horses for courses. You need to understand your situation and what business structure is going to fit you best.
Of course, there's also industrial law and all that sort of thing you've got to make sure you're complying with. Of course, that tends to change every time we have a change of government, because that's one of the main points of difference with our two big political parties. But it's not just that, it's also registration of business names and stuff. Allira, there can be all kinds of problems in that area, can't there?
There's one very important issue that people need to be aware of, is that people are quite aware of registering their business name, but sometimes they aren't aware of the fact that business name, it's just that, it's their business name, whereas it's not a licence to operate over the whole market. So it's something like a trademark is what you need to register rights to operate in the marketplace.
Right, so you've got to make sure that what you've registered is actually going to give you what you think it's going to give you. Michael, I'm almost scared to ask you about contracts, because I know you're going to say to me, mate, you've got to get some documents. But tell us about lease and supply. Tell us also about general contract stuff that we need to know operating a small business.
Contracts really are the backbone of business. There's no doubt that when you have a friendly relationship, that's one thing. When you're in business, you obviously have to have a business relationship, and that's expressed in a contract. Now, they can be very formal, as in those big written contracts you see, and some big companies, when you deal with them, will just give you a contract and say, sign it. Well, the first thing to make sure you do before you sign anything is actually read it. Make sure you understand. If you're not sure, ask questions of the other party. But you yourself will be entering into contracts, and they can be relatively informal in terms of, it could be an email exchange, but there are some basic things you always want to know is, obviously how much you're going to be paid, what time frame, what sort of services you're going to supply, are there any variations, what do you do if things go up or down in terms of costs, if that's relevant. So the example we saw earlier with the web design, you question, was there a contract? Where was the agreement up front from a legal point of view? Had they thought through some of these issues?
It's not just contracts though, it's also just basic regulations. And I suppose, Don, you're going to say to me, look, it's about networking. For example, APRA. If you're the hairdresser and you're next to the cafe and the cafe's playing music, go and have a yak to him, because he's going to say to you, well, actually, you need to be paying a fee to APRA to play music in your business.
Certainly your network, your local business community is a great source of information to help you navigate through all the processes and issues that you're going to come up against in terms of regulation and compliance. But again, go to places where you can start to access information that will help you navigate through those processes as well. But your local Chamber of Commerce is a great place to start, where you can talk to other people and help you understand those issues.
Insurance is such a big area, and we all know that. What is professional indemnity insurance?
That's where you have a potential for being sued for negligence. That is, just failing to take reasonable care for your particular skill set, your particular area, and you're allowed to take out insurance. Now, obviously, it doesn't cover you to break the law in terms of fraudulent and acting criminally. You're not allowed to insure for that. But if you make a miscalculation, a misjudgment, and you've done it to the best of your ability, but it falls short of that standard imposed by the law, your professional liability insurance can actually cover you if there's a loss, which is a consequence of your particular actions. And the insurance is there to protect, obviously, those third parties, those outsiders who have relied upon your skills.
So if you've taken a contract with another business, for example, or with the government, or it could be with anyone, and they don't feel you've performed, and they can prove that, you've got some backup in terms of compensating them, I suppose.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And also, of course, if you have premises, there's the professional aspect, but there's also what we call the public liability. People coming onto your premises, they could fall over and injure themselves. It's a great idea to have public liability insurance for those other consequences.
So if I'm a doctor and you come to me with a broken leg and I don't fix it properly, I might need some professional indemnity insurance there to cover me off. But if you break your leg when you come in because you got a cold in the waiting room, that's where my public liability kicks in?
That's exactly right.
And also for a contractor going onto someone else's premises, it might be a carpenter or a plumber going onto someone's premises, they cause damage, they can be liable for that as well.
So insurance is another huge area, gee whiz.
And actually, Don picked up an excellent point there, the distinction between an employee and an independent contractor. Employees obviously are employed by your business, and thus you have to provide, as we said, superannuation and other legal requirements, and governed by fairly strict legislation. But you may be using independent contractors. They're people who work for themselves. Effectively, you're outsourcing their skills, so you're paying for them, and you would want a very clear contractual relationship which expresses that's the relationship. And sometimes it can be confusing, and that's where the tax officer will also come and have a look and say, are they really independent contractors or employees?
I know consumer law is another big area, and there's been some changes come January.
Yes, Australia really has had probably its biggest changes in 100 years. What was known as the Trade Practices Act is changing its name, and it will become the Australian Competition and Consumer Act. And out of that, there's something called the Australian Consumer Law, and that will bring together all the sale of goods, so all the state laws, the Fair Trading Acts, which is also state laws, plus the federal laws, all under one banner. That actually should be better for consumers, and I think actually it will streamline business as well.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. And of course, can I thank Allira and Don for joining us on the program? We really appreciate it. And of course, can we thank all the businesses that were on our show? We really appreciate their input and letting us into their little worlds. Now let's summarise this episode of Small Biz Central. Well-organised documentation like emails and contracts helps protect your business should you run into legal trouble. Be aware of your tax obligations, and while the Australian Taxation Office has extensive online resources, many businesses engage professionals like bookkeepers or accountants. Many small business people need a host of insurances, from asset protection to public liability and professional indemnity insurance. Small businesses with employees need to be across their obligations to staff, like occupational health and safety and superannuation. Be careful to ensure protection of your intellectual property, whether it's your name or logo or one of your designs. Okay, so we've got so much other stuff that you can access on our website, www.smallbizcentral.com.au. We'll see you next time.